There were dueling news pieces this week of similar theme, but drastically different outcome. Drastically different volumes, too. One was blasted loudly, and the other was hardly whispered. So you probably only heard about FBI Director Christopher Wray speaking before a Senate committee and promising to bring the full force of the federal Justice Department at remaining unarrested and uncharged Capitol rioters. And I guess if every federal resource available is being spent on that purpose, it might explain the neglect of the other side of the domestic terrorism coin, the red-headed step insurrection that nobody wants to talk about, the months-long attack on the federal courthouse in Portland. While one story is perpetually browbeaten into us, the other story is dismissed, and not just from the news cycle, but now from the process of justice, too. That's the much quieter headline this week. Feds dismiss dozens of Portland protest cases outside of the protest language to describe violent riots. This is great work by a reporter at local NBC KGW. He put in the effort of tracking down all 90 pending legal cases against Portland rioters and found that over a third of them, 31, have already been dismissed. And more than half of those cases dismissed with prejudice, meaning that's it, case over, charges can never be brought again. If those people were in fact guilty, they have officially gotten away with it. And they got away with it despite Christopher Wray's pledge to uphold neutral legal principles. If you attack federal property or personnel, the FBI will find you, he says.
The FBI will not tolerate agitators and extremists who plan or commit violence, period. And when domestic violent extremists use explosive devices, when they attack government facilities and businesses, when they assault law enforcement officers, when they use violence to interfere with the lawful operation of our government, they should expect the FBI to come knocking on their door, no matter where they try to run.
Unless they run to Portland, apparently. If you're one of the dozens of Capitol rioters for whom the FBI is still searching, just plan a Pacific Northwest vacation for a couple months. That's the best path to a clean escape. And it's noteworthy that Wray made the specific reference of attacks on federal police as something that will never be excused. Because that's exactly what's being excused in Portland. Yes, there are a lot of minor charges among these dismissed cases, but that's not the extent of them. Many of them are very serious. 4 defendants originally charged with felony assault on an officer have had their cases dismissed. And just in case you think the remaining 60 cases will tip the scales back toward justice, don't count on it. Sources close to the cases speaking with this reporter say they expect many more charges to be dropped soon. So why, then? Why the differential treatment? Why is the Capitol riot the worst crime in the recent history of this country, but the Portland courthouse riot is nothing to see at all? The obvious answer is ideological, but Christopher Wray and the rest of the Justice Department deny that explanation.
As I've said many times, we do not investigate ideology, but we focus on acts of violence and violations of federal law.
Never mind that 30 seconds before that, he had just explained how he prioritizes ideology in investigating crime.
Back in June of 2019, under my leadership, we elevated racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism to our highest threat priority.
And never mind that there's no evidence that racial motive was the driving factor in either of these incidents. There's absolutely no ideological preference at all to explain the different outcomes here. That's what Christopher Wray insists. And we'll get back to that explanation in a moment. But in the interest of being thorough, fine, let's humor him. Let's consider the explanations for this differential treatment that the Justice Department wants us to believe. Prosecutorial discretion certainly doesn't explain these lenient Portland outcomes, at least not up until very recently. These Portland cases were under the oversight of U.S. Attorney for Oregon Billy Williams, who started the job under Obama and then remained under Trump. And I don't know his politics, but he clearly is not rioter-friendly. Last summer, he was heard outside the vandalized courthouse, vowing to bring justice and dunking on reporters who tried to excuse the crimes.
Do you think it's okay? Is there any justification for this? I hope not.
You feel like the late night demonstrations are taking away from the fight for racial justice.
These aren't late night demonstrations. This is criminal activity.
I just said the late night activity that you say is criminal, right?
What I'm saying is, why can't you call it out as such? Late night activity, it sounds like a party.
But I'm just saying, I'm not a police officer. I don't get to distinguish that. That's not my job.
No.
Yeah, it's not in her job description to accurately characterize the story. Ironically, That's probably the most honest reporting she's ever done. And hey, we'll take it, even if it was accidental. Anyway, it clearly was not Billy Williams' priority or preference to let these Portland rioters go. In a September press release, Williams' office said, quote, "Make no mistake, those who commit violence in the name of protest will be investigated, arrested, prosecuted, and face prison time." Turns out, go ahead and make the mistake. Actually, it doesn't really matter. But whoever's mistake it was, it won't be Billy's anymore, because as of Sunday, he's out. His resignation effective at the request of the Biden administration. It wasn't necessarily specific to Billy. Most U.S. attorneys also got the kick of the boot on Joe's hairy leg. So if it wasn't a rioter-friendly federal prosecutor then, it almost certainly will be now. But according to Billy Williams, these dropped Portland cases weren't a question of prosecutor effort. They were a question of the evidence. He says in many of these cases, the evidence just wasn't all there.
Williams explained, if prosecutors don't believe they can prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt, it will be dismissed.
Each case was analyzed for the evidence that we had at the time, and careful decisions were being made on whether or not someone should be charged based on the evidence.
And I have a hard time believing that, given all the surveillance cameras on the courthouse and in downtown generally, given everyone recording everything on their phones at all times. In many of these cases, the only reason we know a crime occurred at all is because we can watch the crime occur on video. But this guy's brought way more charges than I ever have. He's persuaded way more juries than I ever have, and that's the explanation that he's going with. But a legal analyst, speaking with this reporter, says it's actually more of a question of resources. How much effort do you want to put into these mostly petty crimes?
Laura Appleman, law professor at Willamette University, believes this isn't about politics. It's about resources. In an already busy caseload, federal prosecutors must decide if it's worth their limited time and energy to prosecute each and every protest case, most of which are misdemeanors.
And maybe those are legitimate considerations, but those are the exact same considerations in the Capitol riot cases, too. There are dozens of individual charges and cases, mostly misdemeanors, and yet in that context, it's not about evaluating the efficient use of resources. It's about chasing even the minor crimes to the end of the earth. Resources be damned.
The FBI is committed to seeing this through, no matter how many people it takes or how long or the resources we need to get it done. We will bring to bear the full weight of our resources, our experience, and our partnerships.
I understand. These are different people with different roles. Billy Williams is not the same person as Christopher Wray, and they don't do the same job, but they are both cogs in the same Justice Department machine. And this machine that sees petty offenses in Portland as insignificant and not worth our time sees the same petty offenses at the Capitol and instead shifts into overdrive to create ways to maximize them. Arrest them on misdemeanor charges and then find the felonies to add later. That's been the game plan with the Capitol riot the whole time. Detain them first for something small, and then find a way to press a sedition charge or a conspiracy charge or a felony murder charge. If you were within a mile's radius of the so-called murder of Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick, then you're a murderer too. Even if 2 months later, they still can't find a way to bring an actual murder charge for the death itself. In one setting, low-level crimes are a reason to drop the cases and move on. In the other setting, low-level crimes are a reason to upcharge and punish to the maximum possible extent. And the only plausible variable to explain this differential outcome is still being denied. Oh, this has nothing to do with ideology, because if it did, our rule of law would be meaningless and our country would be made a mockery.
That siege was criminal behavior, plain and simple, and it's behavior that we, the FBI, view as domestic terrorism. It's got no place in our democracy, and tolerating it would make a mockery of our nation's rule of law. The rule of law, of course, is our country's bedrock, and it's our guiding principle at the FBI.
He says this while overseeing the mockery. He is mocking you while warning that such mockery would be the destruction of the country. And the only way to square that commentary with the blatant double standard we are watching play out under his watch is if that is, in fact, the intent. Mockery is not a forewarning. Mockery is the design. But whether it's intentional or not, he is right. That sort of mockery will lead to destruction. When different rules so clearly apply differently to different people for committing nearly identical crimes, why would anybody bother following the rules anymore? There's no incentive to do so because following the rules just puts you at a disadvantage to get abused by the next guy who doesn't and gets away with it. And there's no deterrent factor to follow the rules either. If you'll be punished to the maximum possible extent anyway, you might as well get the most out of your crime spree. If scuffing the Capitol floor and killing a guy will be molded into the same crime, why would you be careful with your riot? Go wild. Create some memories. Eroding the impartial and evenly applied rule of law in this way is a guaranteed path to chaos and lawlessness. Christopher Wray warns us that domestic terrorism is a metastasizing problem, yet he is the metastasizer in chief. This is a guy smoking a cigarette in a tanning bed and warning us about cancer. He's the guy who looked the other way for an entire year of crime he now calls our top priority. If the problem metastasized, Chris, who oversaw the metastasis? You don't get to be the doctor who designed the treatment plan and then lecture the rest of us when it doesn't work. Because such treatment, of course, would be a mockery. It would be a mockery to excuse some people but persecute others for the same crimes. It would be a mockery to warn gravely of such a thing while actually doing it yourself. It would be a mockery to insist that we should believe in the integrity of your words before our own lying eyes. The mockery is already a given. The only question is the joke is on whom. And with the precedents being set, we won't decide that with a roast like a comedy club. We'll decide it with a roast like Portland. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below and especially over on Gab. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.